Good afternoon. Welcome to the Effective Approaches to Evidence Inventory Documentation webinar. First, we would like to thank Becca DeHaven, Events Technology Assistant here at Middle States, for helping with this webinar today. As a reminder, the information provided in this webinar is the property of the Middle States Commission on Higher Education, and its use is prohibited without prior written consent from the Commission. I am Ann Wall, Vice President for Institutional Field Relations, and I'm joined by my colleague, Sean McKittrick, also Vice President for Institutional Field Relations. We are delighted that we are also joined by our co-facilitators, Bushra Rahal Alameh and Marina Malamud. Both have experience successfully prepping an evidence inventory at each of their institutions. We are deeply appreciative that they are sharing their time and expertise today, and especially for Bushra, who it's 8 p.m. in Beirut. So wanted to kick this off and just really say the information that we're about to provide in this webinar is advice. After reviewing good practices from institutions that appear to have performed well in the self-study evaluation process, including the development, refinement, and use of the evidence inventory. We're going to talk a lot about documented policies, procedures, data, and guidelines. And please note, the Commission does not require such for every single criterion of every single standard, because you may not have everything for every single criterion. There are many, many good practices throughout the Commission, and we're delighted that Bushra and Marina are here to also highlight their institutions. Just a little bit of housekeeping. To facilitate receiving questions, we are using the Q&A option provided in the participant panel. So please submit your questions as we move through the webinar, and all the questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. Our main goal today is to help clarify the overall expectations for your evidence inventory in terms of an approach and quality. We will identify differences between policies and procedures and guidelines, as well as those structures and how they relate to quality evidence. And we're going to emphasize the need to ensure accessibility, accuracy, comprehensiveness, and efficiency when you're developing your evidence inventory approach. So just so we're all on the same page, we want to talk about the term evidence inventory. This means the repository of documents institutions assemble in preparation for an evaluation visit, or sometimes for another type of compliance visit. In the past, institutions have always created some type of evidence inventory. It might have been a documentation roadmap, a document room, or even an exhibit room. And evaluators reviewed the materials in order to document compliance. So just keep in mind, institutions will still create this internal approach or inventory and collect and archive evidence in order to support the standards, the working group inquiries, and document compliance. And the inventory may get refined as the process progresses. However, what's different for most institutions is now they will be uploading their evidence into the Middle States portal. So the peer evaluators are able to access an institution's evidence inventory via the Middle States portal. And that may be new for many of you. I also just want to remind you that evidence is required under the Commission's accreditation review cycle and monitoring procedures. Also, just for your planning purposes, a longer way out for some of you, when you are nearing the time for uploading, the institution will upload the self-study report and all of the supporting evidence to the secure Middle States portal no later than 6 weeks prior to the on-site evaluation visit. So just something to remind you for your planning purposes. We're going to pause here and launch a little poll, which will help us understand your level of experience with creating an evidence inventory. So please identify your level of experience relative to developing some type of evidence inventory, or whatever it was called in the olden days, for accreditation purposes. We'll give you a few minutes to answer the poll. Okay, so it looks like we had almost 300 people respond, and we have slightly less than 20% have developed a full inventory, and less than half, 44%, have some experience, and about 37% have no experience. So we have Sean, and Marina, and Bushra. We have a little work. We'll have to kind of differentiate our language where we need to. We have a nice mix of folks today. So one of the key things that we're going to talk about throughout the day is relevance. And I think the easiest example why the evidence inventory is relevant is because it's a primary resource. So evaluators and commissioners and institutions can reference what is identified in the self-study narrative to confirm and clarify compliance. I mean, that's the sole purpose, right, of an evidence inventory. But is there any relevance beyond kind of archiving documents for compliance? And what we've experienced, and we'll talk a little bit about today, is a well-crafted evidence inventory can also be used, and again, in addition to compliance with the standards, to really support continuous quality improvement and advancement of an institution's mission. If you can ensure the value add of your evidence inventory, and we're going to hopefully do that today by addressing some common expectations of quality, and the goal is to avoid a documentation approach with thousands of pages, hundreds of links, and massive amounts of information that are a bit unwieldy and difficult to manage and may not be aligned to the standards or institutional priorities. So we're going to really try to help focus on a well-crafted evidence inventory that will serve dual purposes, not only for compliance, but also to support the institutional priorities and advance the mission of your institution. We hope your participation in this webinar today will help you think through the best approach for your institution. So commission staff have reached out to some evaluators to say, are there things that we could do better, stronger, and faster to help our institutions relative to the evidence inventory? So not only evaluators, commissioners, and anyone else that uses the evidence inventory. So I wanted to share a couple things with you. On the left-hand side of that slide are kind of the strengths and good practices that emerged from those conversations and those discussions, and then some of the opportunities for improvement. But really concern that information found in an evidence inventory seemed to have little connection to the actual self-study document or the narrative itself, made it very difficult to confirm the claims made in the self-study. So that notion of being disconnected. Also that the documents and the self-study narrative itself had maybe institutional jargon or abbreviations or phrases or terms that were not familiar to the reviewers. And so it was difficult to follow. Or that the evidence had little relationship to the standards and their criteria. So they were not as focused or specific or direct as they needed to be. And again, there is so much to be learned from institutions that have excelled in this area. So let's check in with our co-facilitators and see if they can give us any initial tips to kick off our discussion. So Bushra and Marina, do you have any guidance as institutions begin developing their evidence inventories? And maybe what were some of the first steps you took?
Yes, so I can start. You know, the main focus in the self-study is to, as Anne said, to confirm compliance. And we want to confirm and verify this to external evaluators who don't know our institution. So the first thing that we need to do is to be clear. And the self-study is a learning process for us and for all the people who are contributing as working groups to the self-study. So the best thing, or the initial thing that we did at the American University of Beirut, is really to set expectations. So as Anne said, the best thing to do is really to give guidance to the working groups who are really crafting the self-study on what are these standards are. And as the poll said, most of us, like 37 and 44%, almost 80% had no experience or some experience in this domain. So we're all started learners in this process. So what we did at EUB is that we wanted to do the evidence inventory in an effective and efficient way so that we safeguard the time and the effort of the evaluation team. And to do that, we have developed guidelines that are customized for every standard. We actually drafted the first documentation roadmap per standard and its own criterion, just to help kick off the work of the committee and the working groups, which were at the time 7 and 1 for the compliance with verification. But actually we also had like guidelines on what is the purpose of this, why we're doing it, how to do it. We wanted, as Anne said, to have really documents that are relevant to the claims that we're stating, that reflect an attestation of the narrative that we're talking about in that specific standard. And we had really a methodology of how to label these documents in order to be clear, accessible, etc. So the guidelines were really helpful to the working groups at the time, and we shared with them initially a list of documents, surveys, you name it, minutes of meetings, so that they follow at least for the first 2 criterion, and then we left them on their own with regular and periodic checks over the 2-year period self-study. And Anne, what was your second question?
And you're muted.
Thanks, Becca. Sorry. Bushra, I think you shared with us what were some of the first steps you took. So thank you. But I do want to point out something that I left out that Bushra said, was that just always keep in mind that the reviewers don't know your institution. And so sometimes I think for all in higher ed, we kind of think everyone speaks the same language or has kind of this, comes from the similar, as much as we try to give you a team that has some experience with your type of institution, that is critical, because you almost have to start with a blank slate and say, nobody knows us. So thank you very much for that. Marina?
Yes, thank you, Anne. So basically, what I would recommend is having a kickoff meeting so everybody will be on board with this project. The second thing is a SWOT. So do an analysis of your strengths and weaknesses and threats and opportunities, and that will allow you to see all the documents that you have and how to organize them. And then what you can draft is you can cross-reference standards, requirements of affiliation with your most important institutions' documents, and then see which one of those documents actually are linked to each one of the criterion, if that is applicable or not. So you will have a clear map of how your institutional documents are linked to the standards and requirements of affiliation. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. Sean, anything you want to add?
No, thank you very much. I think it's so important to be able to, as both have said, have a game plan and not be afraid of that game plan. If you have emptiness to your evidence inventory, that's a good thing. If it's a plan and it's the beginning of your process, probably not such a good thing if it's the day before the evaluation visit, but having a plan from the very beginning and coaching people to understand that if there's emptiness in your evidence inventory because you're not sure where to find information, that's okay. It's just that somebody may not know, you may not know where to find it, but somebody at your institution would.
Great. And I think that's another key point. It is iterative up to a point. right? You're adding, you may be subtracting, you may be modifying, you may be looking in other corners of your institution. Thanks so much. The next slide, we'd like to talk a little bit about kind of effective elements in terms of your evidence approach. And again, this was based on conversations with evaluators and commissioners. And really, in terms of utility, the key piece here we want to emphasize is, again, be sure to include documents that are limited within a certain time range and focus on documenting compliance to specific criteria. So if there's no alignment or no connection, they're not going to be able to utilize it, neither will you, to support your claims. Objectivity. This is really focused on your information is complete, reasonably unbiased and accurate, and appropriately representative. And the third element I wanted to talk about was integrity. Be sure the institution's internal evidence inventory is appropriately secure and reasonably accessible. You know, the information needs to be confidential, it needs to be effectively protected, and the institution has hopefully given some thought to ensuring the information is secure, whether it's your local regulations or your institutional protocols, whatever it is. So be sure that the integrity of your information is maintained. And then reproducibility. This is a slight twist because, again, you're going to have this internal evidence inventory, but you'll want to make sure that this is in some way you have a backup plan or it's housed in multiple spots to ensure you're going to be able to submit the materials, the data, the information, the documents into the Middle States portal when time comes. Okay, so that's in terms of reproducibility or just making sure you have a backup plan. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sean McKittrick, to talk about institutional capacity. Sean, take it away.
Thank you, Anne, very much. So one of the two areas that we'll address in some depth this afternoon has to do with documenting that an institution has the appropriate capacity to remain in sustainable compliance with commission expectations. And institutions can do this in a myriad of ways, including through self-study narrative, group interviews during an evaluation visit, and so forth. One way to leverage the good work being done when organizing an institution's evidence inventory is to see if an institution has policies, procedures, guidelines regarding relevant criteria. That you're able to identify offices responsible for the implementation of such, and then ask if the institution or its units have evidence in the form of perhaps documents, process maps, workflow diagrams, and so forth, which then might be included in the evidence inventory for use by an institution's steering committee, its working groups, by evaluators, by commissioners, and so forth. So asking critical questions about institutional capacity could really help an institution address its overall and sustainable capacity for complying with commission expectations in what we call institutional capacity. So there's really 4 questions that we invite you to ask. And the first question when you're looking at a standard and a specific criterion is to ask, what is expected? In terms of institutional policies, what formal principles or rules serve as a basis for action? For some of you, you may have a system that has, let's take an example, general education assessment. You may very well be a member of a system that has a policy that explains what is expected in order to be found in compliance with the Middle States expectations. So in general education, there might be a document, there might be a policy. If you're an institution that's not a member of a system, there might be a document of guidelines for general education assessment, answering the question, what is expected of us as an institution? The second question that might be asked is, after saying, okay, we have a policy for it, to ask the question, well, how is it done at our institution? What series of steps, methods, courses of action are aimed toward successfully applying these related policies? So, given our example for general education assessment, if an institution has established that it has policies, procedures, policies and guidelines, then it asks, okay, then how is it done at my institution? Is there a faculty senate? Is there a curriculum committee? Is there some sort of process that we really hitch our wagon to when it comes to general education assessment or assessment of unit performance in standard 6 or something of that sort? The third question to ask is, what or who is responsible for the policies and enacting the guidelines or procedures? What offices or individuals are responsible for ensuring successful implementation of policies and procedures? And then, in the interest of populating information into the evidence inventory in ways that are effective and succinct, answering the question, what shows that we've done it effectively? We include representative information allowing internal and external stakeholders to document or evaluate compliance. So you have 4 fundamental questions when it comes to an evidence inventory, at least at the very beginning of your process of populating it. What is expected? How is it done? Who is responsible? And what shows that we've done it effectively? So in graphical form, in employing initial strategies for populating an evidence inventory, our first task is, of course, to familiarize ourselves with the standards and their criteria, but then to go to our institutional stakeholders and answer what is expected. When I was at an institution, I got white-faced several times because I didn't know that I needed to ask individuals. So I went to my boss, who had been there for 17 years as provost, and I'd say, we don't have this, we don't have this. Oh my goodness, we might lose our accreditation. You know, I'm freaking out like some of us do. And she said, well, you know, Sean, maybe you should talk to this person. Maybe you should talk to that person. And you know what? They did have policies or expectations or guidelines that matched very nicely with Middle States expectations. So check there, right? Secondly is, I then asked the question with my provost and with senior staff, do we really know how it is done? And so, given an example like general education assessment, we had a policy through our committee on policies and procedures, and we also had a guidelines document that said, this is how we're going to do it. We're going to assess general education in these areas once every 3 years so that we have coverage for all 9 of our general education areas. So make sure that I include that document in the evidence inventory. And then answering, well, who or what does it? Well, part of the answer was me. I was responsible for enacting the policies, but so was the General Education Committee. So was the Faculty Senate Committee that was assigned to this. All that had policies and procedures, but there was a document, and I developed a workflow diagram that helped us understand not only what the process looked like, but also who was responsible. And then, of course, we needed to look, having established that we had a general education policy, we had procedures for assessment, and we had structures in place, answering the question, what shows that it has been done and that we are continuously improving, and doing that work and seeking to include summary information in the evidence inventory so that our external and internal stakeholders would understand what we are trying to demonstrate instead of going through 5,000 pages of documents. I think, and you and I were talking the other day about some institutions have this habit of printing things off of an electronic interface and putting that in the evidence inventory. Well, that's not particularly appreciated by evaluators. And so finding ways to succinctly present this by saying policies, here they are, procedures, here they are, structures, here they are, those three things establish a sort of baseline and helps evaluators interpret the evidence correctly during their visit. So let's say, for example, that an institution has identified mission, values, policies, and procedures in their efforts to evaluate or to document general education assessment. So they find a document that may or may not look like this, and evaluators will tend to look at this and say, all right, so at least I know there is a policy, at least I know there is a procedure, and I don't have to hunt for this. Now, don't panic if you don't have it this nicely done, but the idea is to have some document that will enable evaluators to understand the underlying structure for what you are trying to evidence. So, for example, an institution might consider putting, let's say that an institution is interested in evaluating general education curriculum and programs of study. Producing a diagram or a workflow can be very helpful to evaluators. It's very succinct. It is not, 20 pages of this person does this or some person does that, but one can use this information and say, all right, having established this information, I'm going to write a paragraph in the self-study report and reference the evidence inventory so evaluators understand how to, what the workflow is. And then some institutions over the last 3 years, as we studied the evidence inventories, do produce organizational charts. So evaluators know who to go to, and institutions can make the very same claim in their self-study reports to tell evaluators and commissioners who they need to go to or what documents to use. And then many institutions, what they do is, having established policies, having established procedures, having identified structures, they then present the results of the assessment process here. So for example, you'll see in the first column a number of student learning outcomes where they have evaluated student performance using course embedded assessments such as papers or rubrics applied to assignments or portfolios. And then in the final column, you'll see the percentage of students showing, or this percentage of reports showing improvement from one time period to a second time period. Evaluators appreciate this sort of presentation, especially in the self-study report, if a limited number of results are described and then it references this document so that so evaluators can confirm and clarify. This example was given by Manhattanville College, which did a great job in demonstrating evidence, but also in populating an evidence inventory. And then the remaining question is, of course, having established policies and procedures, having helped evaluators understand what the structures are, and having presented assessment results, then producing evidence of what was done as a result of the assessment results in a way that is succinct enough for evaluators not to complain. I have to go through 50 pages. they actually are able to see the results in the evidence inventory. So again, what is happening is in the evidence inventory, one can almost envision a sort of title page, general education assessment, followed by maybe a PDF bookmark that says policies or general education assessment guidelines passed on this date, followed by something that says these are our guidelines or our process flow. This is what so far the assessment results have been, and this is how these results have been shared and how they've resulted in something in order to be in compliance with, in this case, portions of Standard 3 and much of Standard 5. So our co-presenters, a question that I'd like to ask both Marina and Bushra is, in your sense, what were some of your greatest challenges with regard to, after you've gotten over the initial shock of having actually populated an evidence inventory and relating it to the self-study report? What were some of your greatest challenges?
So one of the greatest challenges that the Inter-American Defense College had was that we have a very transitioning culture. So this was a long-term project for a short-term staff. So commitment to finding the right documents at the right time was definitely a challenge. And I'll tell you how we coped with what we did about it. The knowledge management was a problem, and assessing our assessment towards the evidence inventory was another challenge that we faced. So those were basically our challenges, and also finding the documents, because since we have such a transitioning staff, people like actually signed some documents and we couldn't find them, physically speaking. And so it's been 60 years of the IADC. So in 60 years, you can imagine there was a lot of documentation that had to be found before the era where we used computers.
So Marina, take us to now then. How have you, now that the visit is over and you did so well on that visit, how have you made the evidence inventory, so to say, your own to make sure that it's sustainable?
Yes. So we launched several initiatives that can be helpful to other institutions. One of them was a knowledge management policy. And that can work very well for these kind of institutions that will rotate their staff and professors every year or every other year. So if you have a knowledge management policy, everybody will know where to leave their documents, their working documents, their policies, everything that is signed, everything that is still in progress. So we have a SharePoint. We used Microsoft 365. So we have a SharePoint, and there's a folder that is called policies. And we have a point of contact for that. So there's an office dedicated to the knowledge management. So if you have any doubt about any policy in the past, present, or any policy that needs to be signed in the future, you know the point of contact that will collect all that information.
And yours is a small institution, so it's something that you find to be very important to have a unit or something responsible for that. So that's great to hear. Bushra, same question for you.
Yes.
You're a different type of institution, Inter-American Defense College. Marina, how many students are in IADC?
We have 70 students, around 70 students.
Yeah, so a smaller institution. And then to segue to the American University of Beirut, how many students are at AUB?
We're around 8,000 students. So we're
so for your perspective,
yes,
same question. Now that everyone struggles with the initial strategies, making it your own and sustainable.
Yes.
Can you speak to us about your journey in doing that?
Sure. So we're also a long-standing institution since 1866 and more than 8,000 students. We're somehow a large academic institution of higher education. And the greatest challenge back then in developing the evidence in the inventory during our self-study, which was between 2017 to 2019, was that, as Marina said, our documents were scattered in administrative units with the specific individuals somewhere. And at times they were incomplete if we found them, and they were not consistent year to year, so that we can analyze and critique trends, etc. And the documents were lengthy, as Sean described. They were in different formats. Some of them shared with like an Excel file that is not formatted. You can talk about many of the problems of the documents itself, even if they were found. And sometimes when they were shared with us by the working group, they were not relevant to the claims, nor they connected the areas of improvement, as you said. So we were saying that we improved in this area, and we wanted to reflect that they were not directly linked to these areas of improvement, nor to the standards. So basically we had a huge undertaking, but we worked with the working group, with the 7 working groups in a tier system. So the working group members, who were around 8 to 9 individuals, used to collect the data. The co-chairs of the working group used to scrutinize the data for relevance, for appropriateness, for all of these domains you spoke about, Sean. And they used to present it to the steering committee at large. And the steering committee, we had a subgroup of this steering committee that connected all the working groups, and we made sure that the evidence is relevant. Is like you said, we want to show the evaluation team that this is the conclusion behind the document, rather than look at it and figure it out, So we worked as a tier system. This is back then. And now we did, as Marina described, we have already an institutional capacity of policies and procedures that are established. They have a clock every 3 years. They have to be revised, reviewed. And each of these policies, procedures, and guidelines have an owner accountable to the Office of Compliance for the proper implementation, as well as communication to the community regularly and periodically, whether they were revocated, revised based on procedures or issues that happen within the institution that triggers the review and update of these policies. So we have really an established office of policies and procedures that guide the operation we do at AUP.
Thank you, Boucher. So I think it's interesting, both of you have through this journey learned that somebody has to be, or some office or some group has to be responsible. For Marina, you spoke about that in order to establish sustainability. And then both of you mentioned, and I found this really interesting, that working groups and those sorts of things are oftentimes employed because it cannot be just one person, right? Not one person knows all things. So that's very, very interesting. Thank you. I'd like now to turn the time over to Anne, who will speak about aspects of evidence quality.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks, Boucher and Marina. That was a great conversation, and really emphasizing as Sean said too, the need for some level to be centralized in order to sustain it, but also technology. You both talked about different ways to kind of move past the paper and the binders and just documents all over campus. So some good tips and strategies. So I'm here to talk a little bit about accessibility, comprehensiveness, accuracy, and efficiency as kind of overarching aspects of the quality of the evidence. We're going to kind of just change a little bit from institutional capacity to the evidence quality. So I'm going to share with you a series of slides. So the first is that the evidence is accessible, and we've talked about this, and you'll see the themes and the patterns and the terms repeat, and we're hoping that helps things marinate a little bit. But a well-organized evidence inventory is everything for you and for your peer evaluators and commissioners. But there's some key principles that we want to share. One is that evidence or exhibits directly relate to the criteria and requirements. Sean, later on, we use a phrase, everything, I think the kitchen sink, but I mean, this notion that more is better isn't always the case. So think about that. It really needs to be directly, any evidence directly relates to criteria and requirements and supports your self-study narrative. The blue balloon in the middle, it's organized by standard and criterion for easy information retrieval. Think about your reviewers. They have a report that they're going to complete, and it's in order of the standards, and it's in order of the criteria. So the easier you can make it for them to access this information, the better. And then we talked throughout this whole presentation today about the evidence inventory labels, because we've heard so much about folks who've had challenges trying to find things. They're labeled something in the narrative, something different or not at all, those kinds of things. So in terms of making sure that evidence is accessible and keeping your audience in mind, back to what Bushra said earlier, and I commented, folks don't know your institution. So the more you can provide a roadmap and pathways, the better. Evidence is accurate. I know this sounds like what? Who would be not having accurate information? You want to make sure it's technically correct and it's current. I've been on as a peer reviewer institution who the latest data they shared with us was from 2012. It was almost 10 years old. Not sure how much utility they really had with that level of dated data, and have not had anything since to compare it to or build on. But please be sure to reference the responsible parties. You'll see on some of our slides, we say middle state staff source, or we even cite the institution. But typically, for the purposes of the evidence inventory, the data sources are usually noted at the bottom of a document or in the narrative, where you say the Institutional Research Office provides an annual blah, blah, blah. So, and Sean mentioned this too, it's a way that the evaluators can also recognize who the data source is and potentially want to meet or talk with that person if they're not already on the interview list. But it also shows that kind of the systematic, whether it's centralized, whether it's, you have an institutional research office that's providing data, or some type of office versus other folks who are just creating their own data. So also just the next piece I wanted to share, the third, this little example. Some institutions at this stage are using Tableau or something else for dashboards, or they create summary tables similar to what Sean had described earlier. And again, focusing on current, clear, and technically accurate evidence. You want at a glance for the reviewers to be able to say, okay, this is 3 cycles, there's the benchmark, there are some of the knowledge or skills, and here's 3 years of data, and you can see the source. So just a snapshot. Everyone does it slightly different, but just wanted to show you where you might find this reference in Standard 3, Design and Delivery of the Student Experience, or Standard 5, for Educational Effectiveness Assessment. And then this notion of being comprehensive, that the evidence is pervasive, compliance in substantial measure, and that the evidence or the exhibits are appropriately representative. So you want to make sure that you're addressing compliance at all levels. And in this case, we're talking about institution and individual, but you also want to think about degree level and modality, and some of the other types of levels and different individual units that you want to be sure to include. So one of the things that Sean and I talked a lot about is appropriately representative. I mean, the conversation goes back to, that's kind of where sometimes evidence gets literally stacked up, where you're trying to show, for example, faculty qualifications, and an institution submits 300 CVs and expects the reviewers to look at the CVs to determine the quality. You don't want that to happen. You want to have representative samples of maybe a CV, but you want to summarize the key qualifications for the reviewers. And so here's a hypothetical institution that's chosen to include another high-level summary. This is a plan for one general education student learning outcome to accompany the discussion and the narrative about how they support and sustain assessment over time of student achievement and communicate the results to stakeholders. This hypothetical institution provided an institution-wide timeline to show the entire schedule, and then a more detailed sample that included kind of key elements of the assessment process for one of the outcomes. This is one approach, and depending on the size and complexity of an institution, I mean, this institution may have 3 particular student learning outcomes, and so they show all of them. A larger, more complex institution may have a different strategy or approach. So wanted to give you a sense of a sample can provide a nice snapshot of the quality of the overall assessment process as one, instead of maybe there's 15 of those. So back to organization again. You've heard this frequently today already too, but that evidence is efficiently organized. And not only it's for internally, for your faculty, for your staff, but for evaluators and commissioners. An efficient evidence inventory should facilitate and not distract from. And so cross-references to a self-study narrative are essential. This is, I believe, a Dr. McKittrick patented term, skimmable. You want to make sure that things are skimmable and that a review team doesn't have to live at your institution for a month to figure everything out or read things or understand your culture or anything like that. And again, back to the no kitchen sink approach. It's not helpful to think more is more, and that if you have a lot of information, it makes for a stronger evidence inventory. It's really about the quality, the way it's presented, how it's cross-referenced, and how concise it is, how current it is, and that you've had some opportunity to evaluate this as a team before anything goes into the evidence inventory. Some institutions even have like a glossary of terms, which they still use their own terms, but they provide a glossary. So it's a little less time in trying to figure out what's what. So I just wanted to talk a little bit again about, don't feel that you have to have this exhaustive list of documents that you've emptied, everything again, in terms of the so-called kitchen sink approach. It's distracting. People have to hunt for things. Sean uses an example, I think, of when an institution was talking about fire codes and different kinds of things that were not related to any standard or criteria. And so it became a little bit confusing as to why it was included. So really build into your process a way that you can ensure that everything is efficiently organized. Again, remember your reviewers. They're going to complete a report based on the standards, following the criteria. So here's another example that an institution allowed us to use. Again, as part of their recent self-study process, they provided a succinct summary of the evidence inventory that could be included in the commission portal. They could point to this in the text of the self-study report to help reviewers. And again, it has the skim factor where a reviewer could look through and see what's provided and be able to work their way through that versus samples versus hundreds of documents. So a reminder, not only your self-study, but the evidence inventory, it's really for your institution, the evaluation team members, and the commission. And then we've talked about, the life of it. How long could that live and for what purposes? Is it a way that you could continue to evaluate your institutional priorities and your mission? How can you sustain that and make that valuable to your institution? And then again, just a refresher, because we didn't say this enough, at the risk of a lot of repetition, but a few points are worth really emphasizing. How you label or create your sub-labels. We need really to emphasize this for reviewers: short and meaningful, ordered as expected, keep them simple, and then consistency across criteria and standards. Any headings, any transitional phrases, any visuals, anything you use should be consistent across the criteria and the standards. And the answer why, it's the ability to skim and move through things, lots of things, and empowers the review in a very natural, sequential manner. Again, think of the report, minimizes the time on task, and enables a thorough review. So, Bushra and Marina, can you talk a little bit about how you ensured, or how you're currently ensuring your evidence inventory is accessible, it's accurate, it's efficient, and it's organized? I mean, what were some of those kind of strategies you employed to face any of those challenges?
So to answer you, Anne, at the time, it was it's different than currently, because our self-study, as I spoke back, it was in 2017 to 2019. So basically back then there was no Middle States portal that they shared. So we have created a SharePoint portal on our institutional website, and we gave access to the evaluation team, and we divided and developed it by chapter, which is standard and its own criteria. We used all the recommendations you just described about the labeling, keep it simple, relevance, etc. So because we went through iterations and consistency across all standards, and we did cross review between the co-chairs of the different working groups, we felt that we were ready to, we were happy with the quality that of the evidence inventory, and we gave access with the secure portal to the evaluators back then. Currently, we're using it for many purposes, not only because we're not under review until 27, 28, so we have a long way to go, but we're using it a lot internally for reporting, mainly for closing the loop. And I think this is very important. Like the slides you showed about the institutions show the trends, the analysis, the critique, but we wanted more to comply with the standards of how to link planning to assessment to budgeting, which is standard 6, which we were barely meeting at the time. And we wanted just to allocate resources based on institutional priorities, from the program level to the unit level to the institutional goals of the institutional strategy. So as well as communication. So we're using the evidence inventory as the base. And as Sean said initially, if we have an empty slot somewhere according to because Middle States, we're grateful to Middle States. We keep an eye on the expectations and we move accordingly. So if we feel like there is something missing, we make sure that we implement it institutionally. And now we have two basic things for data. Let me highlight the difference between data and documents. So data, we have restructured 3 units and merged them into an institutional effectiveness and decision support unit, which is now the data hub, as well as organically and operationally, we're using many venues for knowledge management, as Marina said, just to share the expectations.
So terrific. So you were part of the old school, and you have already really started to plan for 2027, 28, but
Yes.
also advancing the work that's going on within your own institution. So great example. Thanks, Bushra. Marina?
So for those that are just starting with the inventory, we use the less is more approach. And I a lot of people will have the question of, what is relevant? How do you know what's relevant? And the approach that we took is we looked at all the standards and the requirements of affiliation. We look at our draft and we wrote it in an academic style, like an APA style. So for every time we will answer each one of the criterion, we will make sure that will link to a specific document. If you don't have a document or you don't have a policy or procedure, then we will see, we will see that that's a gap. So that was I think it was interesting for us. It can help people do what you just said, that you linking both parts, Middle States expectations and the institution's policies and procedures. The other thing we did is we sent an org chart to the peer review team way in advance, so they knew who to ask for each one of the questions. And we had an Excel file with a reference number, and that reference number was exactly the same number that they could find in the narrative. So that was schemable, very easy. So they could just see the peers when they came on campus, or actually it was virtual at the time, but when they virtually came on campus, they could see the Excel file without looking at the narrative at all, because they knew, which one of the documents will correspond to each one of the standards and requirements of affiliation without having to read, because we wanted to save them time as well during the visit. So that's what we did to prepare for that.
Okay, great. Thank you both so much for those strategies to face some of these challenges. Our next slide is back to Sean to conduct our exercise.
Now is time for some fun. I thought that we mix it up a little bit by doing a chat exercise, very brief, but to give us a chance to perhaps interact and to address any questions that you might have. So if you haven't already, the reference for this exercise will be standard 3. And we're going to look at criterion 2, which really contains the faculty expectations. So criterion 2 of standard 3 says student learning experiences that are designed, delivered, and assessed by faculty, and then addressing sub-criteria A, B, C, D, and E by looking at an evidence inventory approach that is admittedly fake. There's no institution called Poughkeepsie Institute. I think so. I looked it up. I don't think there's one that exists. But to look at their evidence inventory approach through the use of labeling. So what we're going to ask you to do is, if you have not had a chance to do so already, and don't panic if you haven't, we'll provide it in a subsequent slide. First, review standard 3 criterion 2. And then in our fake evidence inventory, Poughkeepsie Institute, we want you to review the labels. And then reflecting on the areas of quality that Anne mentioned, identify strengths and weaknesses, and make some suggestions by accessing the chat function in today's webinar. So many of you may have already received this. I apologize that it went out a little bit late, but again, the instructions noting we want you to review the sub-criteria for standard 3 criterion 2, read the listing of information in the fake evidence inventory labels for Poughkeepsie Institute, and then think about those qualities that Anne spoke about and speak to strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities for improvement. So here is Poughkeepsie Institute, their evidence inventory for standard 3 criterion 2. And so we're going to ask you to take a look at this, and we want you to give us some feedback through writing what your thoughts are in the chat function. Next slide, if we could, please. Thanks. And so we want you to look at evaluating what we have from Poughkeepsie Institute in terms of the information potentially being accessible, accurate, comprehensive, and efficient. And then we provided this table for you. You can use it or not. In fact, you can write this on a napkin if you want to speak about these 4 areas of evidence quality, and then identifying your thoughts about potential strengths and weaknesses. Next slide. And so here's the information in total, and we just want you to look at the labels. Just talk about labeling at this point. What are some strengths and weaknesses that could exist with regard to the items listed for Poughkeepsie Institute? So for example, next slide. Next slide, if we could. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Anne, if you can go back too. This is all my fault, sorry. One more back. Okay, so for example, one forward. I'm sorry, I'm miscommunicating. So for example, on the second page, it says, or the second item of the evidence inventories for Poughkeepsie Institute, it says 2B qualifications. And one of the things I see is TTD, right? And I'm thinking, well, is that an immunization like DTaP? What does TTD mean? Now, most of us may know that that means time to degree, but it really assumes that we know what that means, and assumes an evaluator would know what that means. So my concern would have to be with efficiency, right? That it really does not, it really will require an evaluator to go back and ask what does TTD mean? And really, if that happens too many times, it becomes difficult. And do you see anything there that would be an opportunity or a challenge?
I was thinking, Sean, in 2A for rigor and coherence. It's about rigorous and effective in teaching, assessment of student learning, scholarly inquiry and service as appropriate to the institution's mission, goals, and policies. So in the sense that there's a lot of documents, there's policies, there's workflows, but I was thinking that in terms of comprehension, being a little bit, and accuracy, providing some data as to how do they know that faculty are effective in teaching.
Great, thank you. All right, let's get to work. Several of you have already written in comments. That's wonderful. So go ahead. We're going to give you about 3 to 4 minutes to think about it, look at accessibility, accuracy, comprehensiveness, and efficiency, and look at items in Poughkeepsie Institute's evidence inventory and see if you can see anything. Give you a couple of minutes. Love these comments. I think some of you should be teaching this webinar. I think.
What's nice about having we had, I think, about 20% who developed a full inventory. They've been through this, so this is terrific.
Yeah. All right, so to speak a little bit about some of the things on the chat, I think there's really great. So no evidence listed about rigorous, effective teaching, scholarly inquiry. And interestingly, not a link to mission. And we really do want, if you look at the standards, we do want, of course, that may be somewhere else in that standard, but nevertheless, it's a very, very good feedback. Labeling use is not consistent. The first 3 have an outline look, but the remaining are listed without labels. So there are issues of non-consistency. That's true. Yeah, there may be some issues with overlap with other standards. Let's see. Yeah, abbreviations. How many abbreviations could I have possibly put in there, right? Maybe I was just having a bad day, but yeah, abbreviations. I mean, they do spell annual institutional update on the first page, AIU, really nice. PRR is an old thing. Some of you newbies will know, may not know this, but that's periodic review report. But some institutions use the term periodic review report to mean program reviews of their academic programs. So that could be somewhat vague. Yep. It looks like the evidence library may include large documents, and every document rather than a sample, such as CVs. funny, Anne and I were talking about, what if you have like 1,000 CVs? I mean, do you, I mean, from a quality standpoint, do you really think that evaluators are going to understand something that would probably be 5,000 pages of exhibits? It might be better to put samples in there, and then if they ask, maybe a larger sample or something, just as long as they're representative. Good. Catalog. That was a really good comment. Is it a school-wide catalog or is it an academic catalog? You know, we did an analysis of the evidence inventories, and that came up that some institutions have the institution-wide catalog, then they have an academic catalog. Some institutions have undergraduate catalog and graduate catalog. So being careful about putting in the term catalog without too much specificity could be problematic. Good. Success coaches. So who are the success coaches? And what does success coach mean? Is that a standard 4 thing? What for retention management? If they mention success coaches, maybe it does pertain to faculty, since that's what this criterion refers to. But you're right, it's somewhat vague. Good, and you can chime in here if you want. I don't mean to monopolize, but I'm seeing lots of really
yeah, and you can see the themes and the patterns. They're picking up on lack of consistency, the order. Nobody likes the success coach, just plain.
Yeah.
What I think this is also one of my favorite parts of the evidence inventory is it really forces you to unpack the standards and the criteria. And it's a great exercise institution-wide with the steering committee and the working groups. But look at, even all the folks today are able to look at the criteria and look at the evidence and say, you know what, it's too general, it's too vague, it doesn't match, it's not, I wouldn't know what this means, I don't think this fits here. And so it's all part of really understanding and increasing your awareness and your understanding of the standards and the criteria, which I think is one of the best parts of this activity.
Someone caught hyperlinks. That's right. We don't like hyperlinks. And this is why. Anything could happen after the team leaves. So somebody can unplug it. There can be something wrong with the connection. And yet commissioners do review this sort of stuff when you're up for reaffirmation. So thank you for mentioning that. Comprehensiveness is an issue. That's correct with different things.
Some old data, references to old data versus current.
Yeah, like 2012 to 2022 is a lot of time. That's a century, not technically, but in the feeling, in the sense of us who are in higher ed, that's a long time. And then the evaluator might immediately say, are you saying that almost, what distribution of your work is in 2018, right? Those sorts of things. So this is great. I mean, you really are hitting, but I do want to hit on the positives. I think the Poughkeepsie promise a look forward at the very beginning, at the first document. They do seem to spell it out in a way that many institutions do not. And I do like how that is spelled out, although KPI could be an issue because not all people know what KPI means. An institutional researcher like me does, but that sort of thing. So yeah, so that was a good exercise. And I do recommend using this sort of thing. The commission has used rubrics in the past, and this is based on a rubric, an evidence inventory rubric. And we do recommend using this evaluating evidence quality thing against, share it with your working groups or anything like that if it's useful, because we've heard institutions do that and it is very beneficial to them, as at least they say.
Great. Okay, we're going to move through to, we did the chat exercise, we did the discussion. Any final comments, Bushra or Marina? Any final advice or
Yes,
your number one piece of advice for the folks on the webinar?
Yes, so basically from our experience as already a reaccredited institution who went through this a couple of years ago, is that the evidence inventory is really a very useful tool for two purposes, basically. It shouldn't be like one-time exercise. It should be ongoing and not wait for the next self-study once you go through the initial one. And the most important is to use it internally, as Sean said, to build your institutional capacity in a sustainable way, and not only for external reporting to the Commission, but also for tracking areas of improvement, making sure that we're closing the loop, we're communicating, we're following our guidelines. So, and also reporting to the Board of Trustees, we're using as internally a very important resource tool. And now we built a culture around it. And that's what I think it should be for every institution. Thank you, Anne.
Marina, and then we'll turn it back to Sean.
Yeah, so very briefly, when you are dividing the effort, the evidence inventory is going to take you a lot of time. We didn't know that at the time. We divided the team into different efforts, and one of them was evidence inventory. We did it without knowing how important it was going to be. But I will say dedicate a lot of time to building your evidence inventory in parallel with your narrative. And don't do the narrative first and wait to fill in the gaps later, because it's not going to work. And you will probably have to skim a lot of documents, and your evidence inventory will change over time, from the time that you started with the self-study site up until the time that you have the peer reviewers on campus. So dedicate enough time to that, and maybe a whole team that will work with the evidence inventory. And if you can, do like a Kanban board or something similar to that. A Kanban board is just a board where you put we need to do this, we're doing it, and it's done. And track that weekly or bi-weekly, so you make sure you have everything updated before you submit your self-study. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Sean.
So we want to thank everybody for participating in this. Before we get to questions, this has been, for me, a learning experience. For some of the comments that you've given, and for the nice, very informative comments of our co-hosts. So it looks like we've come to the end of our time. So review our learning outcomes a little bit, if we can. So our learning outcomes were to really be able to introduce or understand common strategies and evidence as it pertains to the evidence inventory, particularly emphasis on policies, procedures, requirements, and standards, and then to various expectations regarding well-functioning evidence approaches. I hope that we've been able, both with our co-facilitators and us, been able to provide information about expectations, and I hope that this has been useful to you all as you move towards self-study, and maybe even using the evidence inventory for purposes other than that. So thank you all very much. Thank you to our co-facilitators and to Anne for participating in the webinar. Thank you and goodbye.